Today on the show, we're talking all about the California Institute of the Arts, better known as CalArts. As a Disney fan, you've probably at least heard of CalArts. A lot of Disney talent graduated from this school, and it was started by Walt Disney himself. But even for myself, there was a lot of CalArts history that I didn't know much about. That's why I brought Disney animator, CalArts graduate, and member of the Board of Trustees, David Bossert, onto the show to discuss. Listen as he talks about the beginnings of CalArts, what it was like being a student there, and his involvement with the school today. All of that and so much more is coming up right now.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, David, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, Jeff, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I'm super excited because very often, I have a brain with too much Disney knowledge inside, and I tend to know a lot about what we're talking about. But today, a lot of this is going to be very new for me, which is why I thought it would be such an interesting topic of conversation for the listeners, because there may be some people out there who don't know anything about this, and then some who have heard about it just like me, but know very little. You are the man with the wisdom today. So let's just jump into it. How exactly did it all begin? Why does the California Institute of the Arts, better known as CalArts, exist?
Well, I think you have to go back to the early beginnings of the Walt Disney Studios. And during the 1930s, Walt was creating, dozens of animated shorts, a lot of Mickey, Donald, Goofy cartoons. And obviously he needed a lot of artists, but he was also building towards creating that first, full-length feature animated film. And so he was bringing in art teachers, art instructors on a regular basis. And a lot of his artists had graduated or had gone through training classes at the Chouinard Art Institute here in Los Angeles. And it was run by Madame Chouinard. And Walt, gradually built a relationship with her, and some of the instructors would come over to the studio to do after hours drawing classes. There were guest artists that were coming in. And this was all about building the skill set of the Disney animators that were working at the studio. And it was driving towards doing that first full-length feature animated film. And so many of the great Disney animators had gone through the Chouinard Art Institute. And so because Walt had such a strong relationship with Madame Chouinard, by the 1950s, Mrs. Chouinard had gotten into some financial difficulties at the school, and there were fundraisers organized. I know Alice Davis, who passed away last year, I spoke with her numerous times because she was a Chouinard Art Institute graduate, but she was also part of the alumni of CalArts because the Chouinard Art Institute eventually became CalArts. And we'll get to that in a minute. But she co-hosted a charity auction to help the Chouinard Art Institute back in 1960. And one of the pieces of art that that was donated was a painting that Salvador Dali had done. And he had given it to them for the art auction. And Walt Disney purchased that piece of art for $2,500, by the way, at the time, which was a lot of money. So, but, because she was having these struggles, I think Walt got it into his head that he started having this idea that it would be really great to bring all the different art disciplines together under one roof in an institute. So there would be fine art, there would be music, there would be dance, there would be theater, there would be film, animation, and all of those disciplines housed under one roof, with the idea that there would be cross-pollination. maybe a musician composer would be helping to score a student film, and maybe the student film was using actors from the theater school, and sets designed by theater students, and dancers, and those kinds. I think that was the original vision. So CalArts was just an idea on paper at that point. He had created a nonprofit. They did a fundraiser, and it was all to build a campus someplace in Los Angeles, and that would eventually house what was Chouinard Art Institute and the Los Angeles Music Conservancy.
So what I love about that story that you just told is that, okay, so his artists are studying at the Chouinard Art Institute, and the school is struggling. And I feel like a lot of people would hear that and say, great, not going into that business. It's not working, right?
Yeah, but Jeff, let me just say that back in the 20s and 30s, the Art Institute was vibrant and was doing well.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't struggling then. It wasn't until the 1950s that there was some accounting irregularities. There was an accountant that apparently had embezzled some funds.
Gotcha.
And so she got into some difficulties, not really of her own making necessarily. She was taken advantage of, and Walt stepped in to help out.
That's cool. Okay, I was going to say, because what I was getting at was like Walt was the type of guy that what some people might see as a challenge, he was like, no, I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna do it right. I'm gonna do it better, it's great. And eventually, the Chouinard and the Los Angeles Conservatory of Music, I believe, were the two.
Yeah, they usually refer to it as the Los Angeles Conservancy.
So it was all this idea was incorporated in 1961 as the first degree-granting institution of higher learning in the U.S., created specifically for students of both the visual and performing arts. So this was founded by Walt Disney and a bunch of other folks, right? In 1961.
Yeah, exactly. And, it was a dream that he had to create this interdisciplinary art institute, both performing and visual arts. But by 1966, Walt had passed away.
Yeah.
He died in December of 1966. And so it fell to his brother, Roy O. Disney, to sort of carry that on along with the Disney family. Lillian Disney and Diane and Sharon. Diane was married to Ron Miller, who eventually became the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. So, and of course, Roy E. Disney, Roy O.'s son, was involved. So, that was the thought behind it, was that they were going to complete Walt's vision along with Walt Disney World.
Let's rewind a bunch. We're skipping over a bunch of stuff here, but it was originally set up as a nonprofit, right? And so Walt was involved with fundraising, and there was a big movie premiere about a certain flying nanny that was used to help fundraise for it. That was 1964, right?
Right, yeah. The premiere at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood was the first official fundraiser. And obviously Walt was putting his money where his mouth was, because he was funding, the forming the nonprofit and all of that prior to it. And he left a substantial gift to CalArts as well after his passing.
Yeah, so in 1961, Walt was obviously around to see it incorporated. As you said, he passed away in late 1966. But from that 1961 incorporation until his death, what did Walt get to personally witness in the development of CalArts?
Well, I think it was really about the formation and bringing on people to a board of trustees. It was also about determining where the school was going to be. I'm not really sure if they had acquired the property in Valencia from the Newhall family, but it was a 55-acre parcel that they settled on just off the I-5 in Valencia, California, near the Santa Clarita Valley, or in the Santa Clarita Valley, I should say. And the other option that I had heard about from Buzz Price. Buzz Price was an executive who worked closely with Walt on the parks. and Buzz had said that there was the idea of possibly doing a vertical institute on part of the property where the Hollywood Bowl is today. And, the Hollywood Bowl was already there, but there was another piece of property, part of that they could have put a vertical building up, a vertical institute. And from what Buzz had said was that Walt had nixed that idea. He didn't think that was a good idea. And that probably is true because Walt had wanted a campus. Which is what the Burbank studio, when he acquired the property in Burbank, California for the new Disney studios. And the Hyperion studio was really like a hodgepodge of buildings that had artists crammed into, and it was very ramshackle to some degree. And so he had bought the property in Burbank to build the Disney studios there, and it was really built like it was a college campus. There was green lawns and lots of trees, and it very much felt like a college campus. And so I would imagine when the idea of possibly having a vertical school near the Hollywood Bowl was presented, I could see him saying, well, where is the lawns? Where is the, outdoor spaces that the artists can, go out to, and why they would have gone to this 55-acre campus in Valencia.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. I can totally picture that. The only advantage I would say of the Hollywood Bowl location is the proximity to the Walt Disney Studios. Very close. Like, was it 5 miles, I think?
Yeah, that's true. But the initial idea behind it was just to have this institute. It wasn't until several years after that campus opened that they decided to create a character animation program, because the people at the Disney studio started to realize all the old timers were starting to retire, and they needed some sort of a training ground for sort of the next generation of animators.
Yeah, there's so many great, like, behind the scenes, of course, on specials and stuff that they showed the animators and bringing animals into the studio for the artists to draw, and, just training on the job sort of stuff. And this kind of replaced that eventually, which is really interesting.
Not necessarily. It created a place where there was a foundation for new artists, but the real training happened at the studio. I often tell people I went through the character animation program. I did 3 years at CalArts, and about 8 months after I graduated, I got hired at the studio. And I learned more in the 6 months that I was at the studio than I did in the 3 years I was at CalArts. I mean, I really was immersed into the Disney animation process once I got to the studio. And there was so much to learn there above and beyond what foundation learning I got from CalArts.
Now, like Walt Disney World, it took Walt's brother Roy O. Disney to see this dream of Walt's completed as well. Do you have any idea how passionate Roy was or was not about this project?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story, and this comes from Buzz Price, because Buzz Price was sort of at the center of this. There was a campus known as the Cabrini Green campus, okay, and that was at the old Woodbury it's where Woodbury University is in Burbank. Mm-hmm. That was the Cabrini Green campus for about a year. So the school was founded in 1970, or the school opened in 1970, but the first year was at the Cabrini Green campus. In 1971, the Valencia campus opened. And once that was open, it was a bit chaotic in those early years. And Buzz told me a story where he was asked to come to Roy O. Disney's office. Now, Roy O. was running the Disney studios at that point. And he went up to see Roy, and Roy told him that they wanted to unload CalArts, and that they had heard that USC was looking for an art school. And so he wanted Buzz to go down to USC and meet with the president of USC. And the deal was they could have the school, the 55 acres, the building and everything, plus $10 million. So Buzz went down to USC and spoke with the president. And the president said, we'd be happy to take the school, but we want $25 million.
So they're not only being given the property, but they're
and the buildings of the school, you know, the buildings as it was, you know, when the campus up there opened, plus $10 million in
they
cash.
offered them 10 million. Who would say no to, like, I'm sure there's a lot of money that you need. I don't know. That just seems like,
and just remember, this
Roy
is
O.
like,
Disney is losing.
but just remember, this is in 1971, $72, which is, I don't know what that's equal to today. But anyway, the president of USC apparently told Buzz Price, and this is coming from Buzz. I mean, I heard this firsthand from Buzz Price, told Buzz that they would take the school and the property, plus they wanted the 25 million, not 10. They wanted 25 million. And so Buzz went back to Roy O and told Roy what the president of USC said and wanted. And Buzz said to me that he told that to Roy O, and he said Roy was sitting behind his desk, and he's just quietly, and he looked at Buzz, and there was this pregnant pause, and he said, Buzz, you can go tell him to go F himself. And I'm being polite, Jeff, because I know, you know, I won't say exactly what it was, but it was go F yourself.
Yeah, that's such a wild story on so many different levels. But first of all, if Roy was offering that in the first place, the 10 million plus the location and everything, like, he really wanted it off of his hands. It sounds
they really did. They wanted to jettison it.
But it wasn't successful because of, you know, that $25 million mark that they put, which is just so crazy. Once again, I'm sure I'm not understanding all of the responsibility of it, but if somebody offers you land and a building and $10 million in 1970, whatever, it's like, take it, is what it sounds like to me. But perhaps I'm missing something. I don't know.
Yeah, you know, something I almost feel as though that the president of USC felt like maybe that he could probably squeeze them for a lot more potentially, you know? Yeah,
they probably just saw him as deep pockets, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's always the case. But, you know, that original Board of Trustees, you know, had some really interesting people on it, I thought. And it's become such a storied institution now and one of the premier art schools in the world. But it did have a shaky start 50 years ago.
Now, eventually, you said it did open in that current location in Santa Clarita, California in 1971, which, you know, as Disney fans knows, is the opening of Walt Disney World as well. So not only was Roy O. Disney dealing with the opening of Walt Disney World, they had this whole school thing happening as well on the other coast of the country, which is pretty wild. I mean...
And I was going to say, Roy O was no spring chicken either. You know, he was up there in age. You know,
in fact, he passed just a couple at the end of 1971, right?
Correct. He was 78 years old, and he died in December of 1971, just after Walt Disney World opened. And it's just like you could speculate that, you know, the stress of it all, you know, was just too much to handle. I don't know. But opening the school and opening, you know, the Walt Disney World in Florida. I mean, there was a lot on his plate for somebody who really should have been enjoying retirement.
Yeah, I was going to say, this was a man who wanted to retire, like right before Walt passed, I believe. Like, he was already talking about retirement, and then he ends up, you know, for 5 years working on Walt Disney World and CalArts and all that, and running the studio. It's pretty remarkable. And honestly, it's just so touching to me every time I hear about what Roy O. Disney did to continue his brother's dream and legacy. I mean, there's a lot of situations, I would say most situations, where it would be like there would be no Walt Disney World, there would be no completed CalArts or anything like that, because the person who really had the dream passed on.
Yeah, but fortunately, his brother was able to carry the torch and see those things to fruition.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to note too that the original Board of Trustees had a familiar name, H.R. Haldeman. And people who know their history, H.R. Haldeman was involved in the Watergate break-in during the Nixon administration. He was, he was, eventually taken down by that whole situation. But you had a lot of very cool people: Chuck Jones, Ron Miller. Some really interesting folks that were on that original board of trustees. And just as an FYI, I'm currently on the board of trustees at CalArts.
Yes. Now, I've actually never been there. I've never been to the campus or anything. Is it something where like the public can just visit it, or is it a gated school?
Well, it is a gated school, and there is security, at the entrance. You can't just show up and wander around. You either have to be a student or an employee or an instructor. I mean, you can always call and make an appointment for a tour.
Sure.
People do that all the time when they're thinking about going to the school.
So for those of us who have never been and some that may never go, can you describe what it's like at all? Is it like the Walt Disney Studios at all? Like, because that does very much have a campus feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, the CalArts has a nice campus. There's a lot of open space around the buildings. And, there are some great art spaces within the building itself. The facility is now 50 years old, so it's undergoing a lot of renovation. There's a lot of things that are happening up there. They just rebuilt the entire animation block, brand new because of water damage that had happened a few years ago. So they're doing some major renovations and upgrading infrastructure on the campus, but it's really a thriving school, and and it consistently rates high among top art schools in the country and in the world, and just throughout the arts communities. CalArts has its own aura to it.
Yeah, it's there's something almost like mystical about it when you hear about it. I'm sure a lot of Disney fans know about the whole, what is it, A113 is the classroom number that appears in a lot of Pixar movies, especially.
I think it appears in all of the Pixar movies, as far as I can tell. I've seen it numerous times, but A113 was in the lower level, and it was sort of a bullpen of students with animation desks.
So from that 1961 incorporation to the 1971 kind of opening of the current campus, what really took that long? I mean, I know this is not something that happens that fast, but a decade is a long time.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the fundraising, because to open up a school, it's going to cost a tremendous amount of money. It's not, Walt wasn't going to foot the bill entirely himself. There were a number of people involved early on who were really championing the school, and that Lulu Van Hagen was really one of the closest. She was a socialite and somebody who was really enthusiastic about being part of this dream that Walt had. And she was, really contributed a lot to the fundraising end of things. But when you're doing that kind of fundraising, it takes years. And then Walt died. So that obviously stalled things a little bit until they got stuff moving again. I mean, that was a huge blow. There was I think you could kind of look at the studio being in a place of what would Walt have done mode for quite a number of years after he passed away. So I think when you do a capital campaign where you're raising tens of millions of dollars to try and build a school, it's not something that's going to happen A, overnight, or B, very quickly because you're creating a new institution that's going to issue degrees, and it's really the first degree granting institute of higher learning in the US, created specifically for students in both the visual and performing arts, and so there's all kinds of entities that you have to, deal with, you have to get approvals for, and all of that kind of stuff takes time.
Yeah. And I know it started as a nonprofit, eventually has become a private college. Do you know when that transition kind of happened?
Could not tell you, but I'm imagining it probably happened when the school opened.
Gotcha. I see. Okay.
It had to have, I would think.
Yeah. There seemed to be a bit of an eagerness to get the school up and running because of that temporary location that you mentioned. Like, they knew that they had that Santa Clarita space and land and they were preparing it, but there definitely seemed to be some sort of eagerness to get the learning started. I would assume.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier, I called it Cabrini Green. It's Villa Cabrini. It was the Villa Cabrini Green campus, or Villa Cabrini. It goes by a couple of, I think people call it different things. But anyway, I think that there was a bit of a delay because of the 1971 Sylmar earthquake. And, the construction of the new campus was really delayed because apparently of some weather. There was labor shortages. You had the Sylmar earthquake in early 1971. So there was a lot of things that happened that delayed the actual opening of the campus. I think they would have preferred the campus to have been completely built and open when the school began classes, in 1970, but it just didn't work out that way.
Yeah. Now, as you mentioned, in 1975, the school opened the character animation program, and the instructors, the professors for this, were Walt's artists initially, correct?
Yes. When I was there in 1980, and the head of the program was Jack Hanna, and Jack Hanna, anybody who's a Disney fan, saw his name on many of the Donald Duck and Chippendale cartoons. He was a great story artist and also a director. And he directed a lot of those Donald and Chippendale shorts in the 40s and 50s.
As you said, you went through the character animation program. What made you decide to try for CalArts?
Well, it's really kind of a funny story because I grew up in New York, and when I graduated high school, I went into an advertising art program at the State University of New York at Farmingdale. And while I was in that program, one of my classes was a TV graphics class where you moved your artwork. And so it was sort of rudimentary animation, but I really found it exhilarating. I was already a fan of animation. And right around that time, a friend of mine handed me an article from the New York Times about CalArts training the next generation of Disney artists. And so there was this kind of perfect storm that happened. And I just, on a whim, decided to send my portfolio out to California, to the California Institute of the Arts. And the interesting thing is that, and I laugh about this because today, if you want to show your portfolio, you just put it on a website. And you just tell somebody what the link, send them the link or tell them what the URL is, and they can go see your whole portfolio on their computer. But this is pre-computer days. And I had a big black portfolio case, big flat black portfolio that I had to essentially make a box for and send UPS out to CalArts for them to review my portfolio. And then they had to send it back to me. And fortunately, I wound up getting accepted to the program. And I also wound up getting a Walt Disney scholarship to go. And that's kind of how I made my way out to California. And while I was there in the program, I was always looking to go back to New York because I wanted to get into advertising. And I thought, I'll go back to New York, get into advertising, do commercials in New York. And I never actually did that because I wound up getting hired at Don Bluth Studios, then Disney, and then I had a 32-year run at Disney. So
that's pretty wild. My gosh. But man, the portfolio days of, like you were sending originals. These weren't even copies, right?
Correct. It was all my original art in a portfolio case, taped up in a box and sent UPS.
I don't trust UPS enough for me not to like lose sleep over something like that. Like, that is wild.
I had no choice.
Of course, you had no choice. You got to do.
You just have no choice. You do what you have to do, and fortunately, that portfolio made it, and then made it back to me, and I brought it back with me when I came cross country to go to school. And I actually still have that portfolio at the house now,
That's awesome. I love that.
It's totally crazy.
It's just wild to think of, like, that's how business was done, right? Like you shipped original art in a portfolio across the country for a college submission.
And the funny thing is, when I go out to speak at schools and things like that, I'm talking to a generation of students who don't know anything other than a digital world. They've just grown up in a digital world with computers and iPhones and all of that. I don't think they can relate.
Yeah. So you're accepted. You get the scholarship. You start going to school. Was it what you expected?
I don't even know what I expected, honestly. But I was in a program with a lot of like-minded artists who, all liked, animation, were fans of Disney or Warner Brothers or something like that. And, again, a lot of them had their eye on working at the studios, whether at Disney or wherever. But, and anytime anybody asked me while I was at CalArts, I always said, I'm going to go back to New York. I want to get into advertising and do commercials and this and that. And, one thing leads to another. And, right out of CalArts, I started working for Don Bluth Studios on the early video game Space Ace and Dragon's Lair. And I worked on those for about 7 or 8 months. And then Don Bluth went bankrupt, and I sent my portfolio over to Disney, and I got hired right away. So I think I might have had a week off, if that. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to work as hard as I can, make as much overtime as I can, and save as much, because when this picture's done, I'm going to get laid off, and I'm going to go to New York and do commercials, And so I did exactly that, except at the end of the movie, when they started laying people off, I was seeing colleagues getting their pink slips and leaving the studio. And finally, I went down to the production manager, who was Don Hahn, legendary, right? So I went down to his office and I said, Don, can you give me an idea when you're going to lay me off, so I can make plans? And he looked at me and he says, oh, we're not letting you go. He goes, you've been working so hard. We're keeping you. I think I did like a Tex Avery take where my eyes popped out of my head, my jaw hit the floor, and there was a honking horn. So I wasn't going to get laid off. So I stayed there, and I went on to the next picture. And I thought to myself, well, I'm just going to work as hard as I can, do as much overtime, save as much as I can, and then I'll head to New York when I get laid off after this picture.
You never made it to New York, did you?
So this happened for like, 4 or 5 pictures. And then I realized, well, I'm not going to New York. But I wound up doing about 100 commercials freelance. And it wasn't until after I had worked, I think it was sort of end of the 80s and throughout the 1990s, I probably did over 100 commercials. And they were all the favorites, Tony the Tiger, Frosted Flakes, Fruit Loops, Toucan Sam, the 7-Up spots, the Keebler Elves, all of these, familiar characters in the cereal world. And I worked on those, just doing special effects animation. I was just part of the team, but it was stuff that I was able to pick up and work at home. on and pick up some extra cash. And it worked out well. So I've satisfied the need to do commercials that way.
That's so fascinating to me because I feel like most people would look at commercials as a stepping stone to a feature or something like that. But you clearly had a passion for marketing.
Well,
that's so fascinating.
No, not necessarily. I think the thing that you have to realize is that when you work on a Disney feature animated film, you could be on that film for 3 years, right? Mm-hmm. And, and depending on when you got on and when you got off the film, for me, I was doing special effects animation, but I might have been on a film for 1.5 years, right? Before I ever saw the finished product. So what was kind of nice is that doing a commercial, you worked a couple of weekends and then, 10 days later, you saw it on television.
Yeah.
You'd be sitting there on a Saturday watching some program and all of a sudden you go, hey, I worked on that commercial like 3 weeks ago, So you got the satisfaction that something that you had worked on actually was completed and out there in the world while you were still waiting for that feature to be finished.
That reminds me of, I think Jeffrey Katzenberg mentioned this in an interview once where he said like one of his qualities is not being a patient person. And he considers it like one of the cruelest tricks of fate that he ended up in animation, which requires an enormous amount of patience because the process is just so long. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah. And so I think, for a lot of artists that I know that are in the animation business, doing some freelance projects on the outside was not only keeping your name alive outside the studio berm, but it was also that satisfaction of having completed something, that you actually saw it done in a reasonable amount of time, not waiting 1.5 years or 2 years,
Yeah. Now, many notable Disney talents studied at CalArts, names everybody will recognize like Tim Burton, John Lasseter, Brad Bird, John Musker, Kirk Wise, Henry Selick, just to name a few. It's pretty remarkable. I mean, it's kind of become a place that if, there's a lot of people out there who dream of, yes, the entertainment industry, but a lot specifically dream the Walt Disney Studios, Disney Animation.
Right.
And it kind of seems like, I don't want to say the easiest entry because that's not the right way to say it, but CalArts is a really good place to start, it seems, and it worked out that way for those people. And at least I feel like that's the mentality of a lot of people. Perhaps it's not the best way.
No, I think it was true to some degree for some time, back in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. But there's since then there have been so many animation programs have popped up all over, not only the U.S. but all over the world. And there's also been a lot of animation studios that have popped up. And so, I think that there's peaks and valleys within a studio and within animation. Who was on top for so many years is not on top anymore, and someone else has grabbed that torch, but they'll fall and the torch will go to somebody else. It's those kinds of things. But there's so many more opportunities today for people who want to go into animation. There's just a tremendous amount of talent out there, and there's a tremendous amount of studios. When I got into the business, you had the Disney studios doing feature films. You had Hanna-Barbera, Ruby Spears, and Filmation doing television. There wasn't a lot of other stuff happening. There was some boutique studios doing commercials and some short films or specialty projects, industrial films. And nowadays, you've got Disney, you've got Illuminations, you've got Warner Brothers, you've got Sony, you've got Netflix, you've got Skydance, you've got all of these companies that are all employing hundreds and hundreds of people
And
to do
DreamWorks.
animated. DreamWorks is there. You've got Blizzard Entertainment doing games. You have all these different gaming companies out there. And then special effects. All of the special effects houses are using animation talent because it's, what do you think all these superhero movies, how do they, create all of those Marvel films and DC films? They're using animators to create a lot of the special effects that are going into those films.
Yeah. Now, today, CalArts is a private university still in Santa Clarita, California. Do you know, does Disney still have any involvement with it?
Yeah, from a corporate standpoint, the Walt Disney Company has a charitable arm of it, and there's always an annual gift happening from the Walt Disney Company to CalArts, and they're helping in other ways. There's a lot of talent at the studios that come up and teach at CalArts, so yeah, the ties are close. Tim Dizney was the most recent past trustee chair for the Institute and had done a fantastic job for like a decade. So, there's absolute involvement within the families, the Disney family and the Disney Company.
Very cool. And there are 6 schools at CalArts, the schools of art, critical studies, dance, film and video, music, and theater. So it's a lot of art going on at CalArts.
Yeah, there was only 5 when I was there, but they added the School of Critical Studies. So you've got writers and poets coming out of that now.
Very nice. And David, of course, you're a graduate of CalArts and on the Board of Trustees. Now, I assume that means you have some great pride in your school. So can you tell me a bit about what makes CalArts special to you and different from the rest?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's, anytime you go to a school, you have an attachment. It's your alma mater. And, I look at my time at CalArts was the foundation for me to have what I think was, a really great career in animation. I worked at the Walt Disney Company for 32 years. I worked on some great movies, got to work with some incredibly talented colleagues, many of whom had gone to CalArts. And I've gone on to writing books and continuing my career in the arts, essentially. And I couldn't have done that, I don't think, had I not had that foundation at CalArts.
Very cool. You mentioned you work on books as well. You do a lot of Disney history books, and one of your most recent ones is The House of the Future, Walt Disney, MIT, and Monsanto's Vision of Tomorrow. Why this subject matter? Of course, this is a classic attraction at Disneyland, but there's so much to choose from when it comes to the world of Disney and anything you can write about. But why the House of the Future? How'd this come about for you?
This was something I was always enamored with, that particular attraction. I never got to see it. It was only at Disneyland from 1957 to 1967. And I had read about it, and I had heard some old timers talk about it, and I've asked other old timers from Imagineering about it. And it was just one of those topics where I really had wished that I could have walked through it. So I thought to myself, the next best thing would be to write a book about it and to set the book up as a tour that if you had gone through the attraction, you'd enter and you'd walk around, and each room you saw, I set up in the book exactly how you would tour it if you had actually physically walked through it. But instead of physically walking through it, you're going to turn pages. You're going to see all these spectacular photos and images of each of the rooms that you would have seen on the tour, as well as a lot of background information on the things that went into building the House of the Future. And I think, it was one of those visionary attractions that, it spoke to me. And it also said to me that this is what Walt was all about. It was all about the future. It was all about a better tomorrow. And that's sort of a common theme about hope. And it's a common theme that runs through a lot of what Walt created while he was alive, but is at the core or the soul of the Walt Disney Company. It's all about optimism and about the future and about creating a better tomorrow and being on the leading edge of technology and what is the next new thing.
Yeah, and one of the tall tales, perhaps, I don't know. I'm hoping you can confirm or deny this, but one of the stories you always hear about the House of the Future is that when it came time to knock it down, they tried to knock it down with a wrecking ball, and because it was made of plastic, it just like bounced off of it, and they had to figure out a different way. Is that true or false?
Yes, no, that's a very true story because what when they decided to take the House of the Future out, they allocated a day to knock it down because they thought with a wrecking ball, bang, bing, bang, boom, they'd smash it to bits and cart it away. It actually took 5 days to take the House of the Future down. The wrecking ball did, in fact, bounce off of the fiberglass shell. They had to use chain clamps, that tighten and crush.
Oh, wow.
In order to break it apart. And the fascinating thing is that the steel bolts that went through the fiberglass flange to hold it to the center core of the house, the bolts actually broke before the fiberglass flange gave way. So that just tells you how strong the fiberglass wings of that house. And just so your listeners know, if you're not familiar with it, the House of the Future was, if you look straight down on it, it was like a plus sign. And each wing hung off of a central 16-foot by 16-foot concrete core. And those fiberglass wings were bolted to the core. And so the bolts actually snapped before the fiberglass broke at all when they were trying to take it down. And it was all carted off to the Brea landfill down in Orange County. So maybe 1,000 years from now, some archaeologists will excavate and find the remnants of the House of the Future.
They're going to be very confused when they find that. That's great. Now, considering you never actually experienced it yourself, how was the research done? Was it through Walt Disney Archives?
Well, I had gotten some information from the Walt Disney Company, but I had gotten a lot of information from the Monsanto Archives.
Oh, okay.
And also the MIT Museum. They were all very helpful. And I also found some information at the Library of Congress and from private collections. And, it was a lot of detective work. But I think I bring a compelling story that fills in a lot of blanks for people about the House of the Future, and also spotlight many of the furniture designers, industrial designers of that period, and really give a little background on some of those folks who designed some really cool things that we all are familiar with and use today. And many of the furniture pieces were done were done by designers that work for Henry Miller, and some of those pieces are actually still available today through Henry Miller. Or no, I'm sorry, I'm saying Henry. It's Herman Miller.
Herman Miller. All right.
Herman Miller. I keep saying Henry. I don't know why, but it's Herman Miller, the furniture company. And they still make a number of these beautiful pieces that were designed by George Nelson, who was a famous furniture designer. So again, a lot of information about some of the furnishings in the house that people never, nobody's ever written about. So I kind of cover some of that in the book. And by the way, Jeff, the book is available. Signed copies are available from theoldmillpress.com. Theoldmillpress.com, if they want an autographed copy. They can get that, I think, starting September 19th. And then if they just want to get the book off of Amazon or Barnes & Noble or at their favorite bookstore, they can get it October 17th.
it's available considerably early at the Old Mill Press website.
Correct. For the author signed copies.
That's very cool. I love that. And your website, mention your website, because there are a ton of books that people should check out and research and everything. What's your website address?
People can go to my website, which is davidbossert.com. It's DAVIDBOSSERT.com. And on that website, there's a tab for books, so you can check out all of my books. And there's links to where you can get them. You can get some autographed copies. There's also a tab on articles and essays. I think there's like 60 of my articles up. It's all free content if people are interested in learning about different aspects of animation and how things were made at Disney. There's a bunch of different topics, from Oswald the Lucky Rabbit to Mickey Mouse cartoons to Disney and World War II and so on. And then there's also a free tab. There's a tab for free stuff, and they can get bookmarks, signed book plates, and coasters for some of my books.
That's awesome.
And all they have to do is send me a stamped, self-addressed envelope and tell me what they want, and I'll mail it back to them.
That's very, very cool. I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about CalArts. I think you need to come back sometime, because there's a lot of books and a lot of other topics we need to discuss.
I'm happy to come back, Jeff, anytime. Just ask. There's always I say this to so many people. There's thousands of stories out there that haven't been told yet.
Totally.
All about the Disney universe.
Absolutely. And that's the stuff I love, right? Like, don't get me wrong, I love talking about the stuff that, is mainstream, but I love the little nuggets. I hope that today's episode was a bit of that. I'm really hoping that people listening didn't know much about CalArts, even if they'd heard of it and learned a lot, hopefully.
You know what? One of the things I did want to just interject real quick, because I was talking about how Jack Hanna had headed the program, but I just want your listeners to know some of the other artists that were there. Tee was teaching caricatures. Ken O'Connor was teaching layout. Elmer Plummer was teaching the life drawing class. We had Bob McCrae, we had Bill Moore, we had all of these people who had worked at one time or the other, except for Bill Moore. Most of the others had worked at the Walt Disney Company. Bill Moore was just a great designer and collector of African art. And a great design teacher. I mean, he's somebody who's impacted so many of the graduates from that period. We all have our Bill Moore stories, but it was just, it was a great atmosphere. There was a lot of really great talents that came out of that studio, out of that school, and are still coming out of that school.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for having me on Disney Coast to Coast.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. David has another new book coming out soon. Let's just say that if you're a fan of Halloween and Christmas, and you love it when these two holidays collide, you'll surely be interested in this book. Visit davidbossert.com for more info. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Dizney with a Z, Coast to Coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. If you're a longtime listener of the show, thank you. And if you have the means, consider supporting the show over on Patreon. By joining Disney Coast to Coast's Patreon membership, you'll gain access to extra bonuses, including live stream Ask Me Anythings. In fact, there's one coming up this month, unreleased episodes, and more bonus content. Take a look at all that's available by clicking the Patreon link in this episode's description, and thank you for considering. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description. From additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!